Is it okay for the church to get involved in the public arena? Should Christians be actively involved in the free elections of the United States of America? Faith Wins is an organization dedicated to engaging pastors, congregations, and Christians in the public arena. Why, you may ask? Because the influence of Christians needs to be felt around this country. Jesus is the solution, and we need to bring biblical solutions to the marketplace of ideas before it's too late, and we need to do it now. There are over 80 million eligible Christian voters in this country, but only 30 million regularly participate in the elections. This needs to change, and Chad Connelly is going to tell you why in just a minute. Check us out online at faithwins.us. That's faithwins.us. When we sit on the sidelines and hope for a better future, the enemy wins. When we mobilize, register, and make our voices heard, faith wins every time. Thanks for tuning in today to the Faith Wins podcast. I'm Jim Brangenberg. I'm joined today by Faith Wins founder Chad Connelly. Hey, Chad, welcome to the show today.
Good morning, Jim. How you doing, sir?
Doing great. Hey, did you grow up in a politically savvy family, Chad?
Well, involved, but no, not involved deeply. They voted and they cared, but not politically savvy at all.
So where did this drive for being involved in the political process, where did that come from?
I served in the Army. My parents talked about stuff and the importance of being an involved Christian. But in my Army time and then starting my own business, I got to meet a lot of just heroes of mine in America and some great speakers. Just the favor of God put me around some of these powerful people that impressed upon me how special it was to be born in America.
And that is a special privilege for sure. So why did you become a Jesus follower?
Well, I grew up in a church. I never knew a time I wasn't a Jesus follower. I actually gave my heart to the Lord in a youth camp when I was 13 years old in Anderson, South Carolina, Camp Providence. And I made him a promise then and accepted him in my heart for real. I grew up in a little Methodist church. If you had your hand raised, you had a question, except right there at 12 when they wanted to make sure the pastor knew that it was getting close to quitting time. But it was a little country church. I tell people I grew up with a drug problem. My daddy drugged me to church and drugged me to youth group. And that's about the truth is I never knew a time when my parents weren't committed to church activities and to the Lord and all that stuff. I just don't remember a time that we're outside of the church.
But you haven't lived a Pollyannic life. You had some tragedy, some significant tragedy that impacted your life.
Yeah, and it's a little bit of a long story, but it does. It's a huge chapter in my life, obviously. As you know, went to Clemson, grew up in this little town in South Carolina, and met this beautiful girl in college. We got married. In fact, the first time I told her I loved her, our prayer was, Lord, let us make a difference in this great world for our nation, but for your kingdom here on earth. We both felt like we had put our fist in a bucket of water, and we pulled our fist out. The hole that was left was a difference we made. We just didn't feel like anything we'd done was consequential, and we wanted to make a difference. That was literally our prayer sitting at Clemson that day. And honestly, the outcome was to get involved in politics, Jim. We started knocking doors, waving signs, doing phones for candidates that we felt like most closely followed their biblical worldview. And that got us involved, not formally. The boys came along in 97 and 2000. I ran for state senate in South Carolina and lost in 2002, but I also wrote a book on American Christian history and free enterprise. But right after that, and I was speaking a great deal all over the country. We had started our own business. I was involved in some issues with the South Carolina Policy Council, which is a pro-life, pro-family group. So I was getting involved in things like life issues and marriage, fatherhood, and then school choice. Of course, we had fought the gambling industry. But in 2005, Michelle's mom died. In 2006, she experienced a deep depression. She had experienced bouts and swings, I guess you'd say, of blues that I didn't think were very significant, quite honestly. But in July of 2006, in fact, 14 years ago, she put a gun in her mouth, ended her life. And the boys and I walked in from church to find her. I knew she was bad. I never knew she'd commit suicide. My boys were 5 and 9 when it happened. And, in that split second that's hysterical and awful and everything combined, calling 911, calling her dad, who had just lost his wife of 40 years after a surgery went awry a few months before, telling him his daughter that was gone. then calling my mom and dad to come and get the boys. Staring at my wife of 18 and a half years, the devil said, "You failed." Just clear in my spirit as it could be. The week before, I'd spoken at Chick-fil-A. I said something I'd never said. I said, I've messed up. I've made mistakes. I've been a failure at business in some ways. I'm never going to fail with my boys and my wife. I looked right at the boys, and I remember thinking, that was really good, Lord. I'm going to use that again. And then when Sunday morning comes around just a week later, that was a Monday morning before, when I looked at her, it was like the devil said, "You failed." Immediately, I felt the Lord put his arms around me. This wasn't my plan, but I have a plan for Satan's disruptions. And Romans 8:28 hit me in the face, Jim. Romans 8:28, wasn't studying it, wasn't reading it. And I literally said out loud, "Lord, all things." Now, I had pushed the boys away. "Go to your room. I'll be right there." Of course, I'm covered in, not a pretty scene. Romans 8:28, he said, "Did you believe it yesterday?" "Yes, Lord." "And when you got to believe it today." And I promised him I would. Now, I fainted in the casket room a couple of days later. My best friend from Texas caught me before I hit the casket behind us. The picking out a tombstone was horrible. I'd never contemplated that. The boys asking tough questions, and we read the word. We talked about a threefold cord is not easily broken from Ecclesiastes. We talked about sticking together. We talked about Romans 8:28, all things. We know that all things work together for good of those who love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. And I would say it over and over to them. And maybe I was trying to remind myself and reconvince myself too. But that fall, Bennett turned 6 in December, and watching him skip away and move forward was the first sign. And so right at that point, I had been to only a couple things. I didn't speak. I really didn't leave the boys. They're tugging at my jacket going, "Daddy, please don't leave. Please don't leave. Are you going to be okay? Are you coming home?" So I was kind of just, grounded, doing okay, but having a hard time. I read 9 books on death, depression, and suicide, trying to figure it out. I had my engineering degree, and I was an Army officer, and we're supposed to be able to figure this out. And I really just came to the base of the throne, the foot of the throne, and said, "God, I can't do this." The first policy council meeting I went back to was in late November, so 5 months after Michelle's death. And one of my buddies came up and he said, "Hey, I know you're not ready, but when you are, you got to meet this girl." I'm like, "Man, JD, I love you, but get out of my face. I'm having a hard time."
Let me just, I'm going to interrupt you there for a second because, suicide is one of those things where the church doesn't even like to talk about it.
Yeah.
So how did your church support you, and what kind of support did you need, knowing what you know now? There may be some people listening today, they're like, "Wow, I tuned in to hear something about Faith Wins, but I want to hear the Chad's story is just rocking my world. I didn't know you could actually talk about suicide and be a Christian."
Yeah.
How did the church come alongside you, and what could they have done better?
Well, we ought to talk about it more. In fact, I'm going tonight, Jim, to love on a dear friend whose daughter committed suicide last week. And I get all these calls. I'm supposedly the suicide expert. I think my church did great. My pastor was one of the first ones there with my mom and dad. He got in the ambulance with me that day. I can never thank the guy. My deacon buddies, my Sunday school class, they had put me in an emergency room, hospital room, to just, I guess, make me calm and all that. I mean, I was calm. I was in just shock. The boys went home with my mom and dad. But my son, they came around us. They loved on us. We were actually building a house, Jim, and my Sunday school class and believers helped us move in, like, I don't know, 3 weeks or 4 weeks after Michelle's death. The funeral was scriptural. It was beautiful. It was a call to anybody who didn't believe. The Lord had put on my heart to leave the casket open. Michelle's dad wasn't happy with me, but 3 people told me they were contemplating suicide, and they didn't understand the ripple effect. I think that what suicide is, and death's tough, right? That's why Jesus came, to destroy the power of death and the grave. And I don't know how non-believers deal with anything like this, but suicide seems to be a depth of betrayal that's really tough. We didn't have any secrets. She was my best friend. We grew up in life together. I knew she was depressed. I didn't think she put a gun in her mouth. Never considered it. My church did great, but you're right. A lot of people really just back off, and they need to be loved. People around them need to understand that God, I think, envelops us in a numbness. And when that numbness wears off, it's really hard. It may be harder than going through, because I don't know. God just, I had a hard time. I couldn't do it. You know, guys, I think, have too much pride. I know I do and did, especially. And, you know, I got this, I can do this. That's part of our wiring. We're supposed to figure this out. And I couldn't figure it out, short of just God's grace and his sufficiency that got me and the boys through it. My church was terrific. I think a lot of churches and Christians, you know, hey, that person, they're so-and-so committed suicide. And there's enough blame internally. I think what I went through a lot and what my friend's doing right now is you inherently blame yourself. What did I do wrong? I mean, I have walked down that path that she walked a million times in my mind. What did I miss? What did I miss? What did she say that I didn't pick up on? And her psychologist came to see me the next day, Jim. I wasn't even going to tell this, but you're right. People need to hear it. And I love the restoration. I hate telling the story, except that God's using it in a lot of places. I've spoken in hundreds of churches now about it. But her psychologist, who's a Christian psychologist, came to see me the next day, and he said something so powerful. He said, Chad, it is normal and human to blame yourself. This is not your fault. I'm supposed to be a professional. I saw her 2 days ago. She was on her meds. I didn't see it coming. You could not have seen it coming. She had made a decision. It was so deep, so dark. She thought that the permanent solution of suicide was, you know, going to be the fix to the temporary problem of depression. And he really helped me, Jim. But I think for the most part, people just loving on us, their presence. My best friend took 2 weeks off from his job. He moved us in the house. He was here. Another best friend helped paint the house, and he just listened to me sob. You know, bless his heart. I'd take the boys to school, and I'd sit in the house and sob, and he'd paint. You know, I had a roller in my hand, but I wasn't very effective. You know, my church, my deacon buddies, my Sunday school class, they were just awesome. And I think they just loved on us. They were present. You know, they brought us meals. And this brings up a key thing about today's society. If people don't have a church home, and I know we're talking to our echo chamber of believers with our podcast probably, and I hope there's a lot of people that stumbled into this that maybe don't have this perspective. But if you don't have a church family in your community, I don't know what those people do, because my church family, they brought us meals. They took my boys to the zoo. They did things like that. They helped me do yard work. They helped me move in, install blinds. I mean, it was like they were there for whatever I needed. And I think that's what we got to do for people going through tragedies like that.
God did bring healing and eventually brought you into a new marriage. Tell us about that story.
Yeah. And it's just amazing. I wouldn't have given you a plug nickel, right? And so I went back to my pro family meeting. That was late November. Yeah. And this guy comes up, a good friend, JD Martin from Greenville. And he says, you got to meet this girl. And I'm like, JD, I love you, but hanging out of my face. I can't handle this. I was not meant to be a woman, and I don't know how to handle these boys, and I'm doing my best. And he said, okay, give it some time. I go back to the next meeting, which was right before Christmas. It was the board meeting to approve the budget for the next year, as everybody who's ever sat on the board knows. And I barely get there. Here comes JD and his wife, Nancy. You got to meet this girl. And I'm like, JD, buddy, I love you. Give it a rest. I'm having a hard time. I'm having a hard time. I never saw this coming. And he said, Chad, I've watched you speak for years. You're Mr. Positive. This ain't going to beat you. And he got in my face and he said, do you know that talk you do about counting your blessings? Yeah, JD, I wrote it. And he said, go read your notes. And turns out it was just like God talking to me. I went back, read my notes. I wrote down 103 blessings the boys and I had. The Lord gave me 3 prayers, very specific. I'm not going to go looking for a wife. You're going to have to stumble me into her. I didn't want a guy in the picture. I didn't know I was praying for a widow. I just didn't want a guy in the picture. And the third one is I asked very specifically, Lord, send me somebody who won't be threatened by Michelle's memory, but will help honor it. So I go back, Christmas happens. I take my ring off my finger for the first time in 18 and a half years. We go to the third meeting, which was in January. Here comes JD. You got to meet this girl. I'm like, good grief. Okay, what's her name? He said, Dana. I said, JD, big question. How'd she become single? And he said, same way you did. He said, her husband committed suicide almost 2 years to the day before your wife. long story short, and it's a whole story that I talk about a lot in churches. We met and we went on a blind date. Turns out she had 2 little girls. And 6 months later, we were married. And that's been 13 years ago. And the kids now are 23, 20, 19, and 18. It was boy, girl, boy, girl. She had the 2 girls. I had the 2 boys. The interesting thing that happened right after we met, I got to tell you, a pastor buddy sent me a sermon series on Acts 12. You know the story. Herod's executing the Christians, the disciples. He's getting popular in the community because of it. Peter's awaiting execution at dawn. Scripture says the angel struck him. I don't know about you. I don't always sleep that well, and I'm not awaiting execution at dawn. And he walks out in the night air. The shackles are off. The guards are out. Goes to the home of the first century church. Greatest believers in history, right? And at Mary's house. And they're praying, oh, God, deliver Peter. Oh, God, deliver Peter. I read all these different versions. You're crazy. Because Rhoda, the servant girl, runs back. She didn't even answer the gate. It's Peter. It's Peter. You've seen a ghost. It's Peter's ghost. You're crazy. Leave us alone. Can't you see we're praying for Peter? And so his point was, don't be the unbelieving believer. And we walk by faith, not by sight, Jim, but I got to watch God work. And that's what led to Faith Wins, because I couldn't have done it without Dana.
Well, on the next episode, we'll talk a lot more about Faith Wins. Thanks, Chad, for sharing that story. And I hope you enjoyed the story today, because it's real. And it's a story that so many people in our country have experienced. And so thanks for tuning in today to the Faith Wins podcast. And remember that when you register to vote and you vote according to your biblical values, faith wins. Hey, thanks for listening to the Faith Wins podcast with Faith Wins founder, Chad Connelly. I'm your host, Jim Brangenberg, and I want to ask you to check out Faith Wins online at faithwins.us. That's faithwins.us. Your vote is needed and necessary, and we all need to learn to engage in our system of free elections right here in the United States of America. If you're not registered to vote, please take time to do so on your local county voter registration website and do it today. In an upcoming election, vote for candidates supporting biblical values and a biblical worldview. Until next time, remember, when Christians engage in the public arena, faith wins.